It'll be an interesting conversation. My name is Scott Fairley. I practice, have a litigation and sometime arbitration practice at Cambridge LLP in Toronto. And I'm a former president of the Canadian Council on International Law, well before my good friend Charles-Emmanuel Côté, who's current president, and Melida, of course, you know. I approached the organizers of this conference a couple of months ago, and given the sort of the sea change in the relationship between our two countries, I thought it'd be a good idea to have a chat about that. And so this is supposed to be a fireside chat. Imagine, if you will, a coffee table, maybe a fireplace, what have you, without the searchlights that are focused on us. Special thanks to Executive Director Michael Cooper for facilitating this. I think I've shared a script with our participants, and they've agreed to the questions. I don't know what all their answers are going to be, so this is going to be extemporaneous, but it's a very fruitful and constructive discussion. I promise you that. Now, in addition to being president of this society, Melida is also an accomplished litigator and international commercial arbitrator. Arnold and Porter, Kay Scholler, I should mention. Those last two names sometimes get left off. So for the Kay Scholler crowd, they're acknowledged too. And Charles-Emmanuel is current president of the Canadian Council on International Law, a professor at Laval University, heads up their graduate program, and is an eminent jurist in our neck of the woods, and should be read down here as well. Now, Canada-U.S. relations have run into, how shall I say, stormy weather since 20 January of this year, complicated by a Canadian federal election that's going to be held later this month, April 28th, where we'll have a new prime minister that may or may not be the same as the one, in keeping with our parliamentary system, took over from Prime Minister Trudeau when he resigned. And Parliament will be reconvened after the election, and so we'll see what goes from there. The resulting uncertainty between neighbors appears to be but one element of a seismic shift in U.S. foreign policy globally, triggering shifts in the foreign policies of all its neighbors, including Canada, of course, one of its closest neighbors. This shift suggests an intentional dismantling of the post-World War II international rules-based order that was first and foremost a product of U.S. leadership with the Marshall Plan and everything that followed from that. Presidents Hodgson and Côté will discuss aspects of this challenge and what may possibly be done to meet it from the point of view of two learned societies of international law in aid, I think I can say this, in aid of that rules-based order. I have some questions to structure the discussion, giving each president alternating opportunities to lead off and then mix it up between themselves. I begin, President Hodgson, you issued a statement on February 13th of this year entitled Regarding the United States and the International Rule of Law. President Côté, you issued a responding statement later that month in 21 February in support of President Hodgson's message. Now, I'll just read to you, not the whole. Most of you, I suspect, have read at least the U.S. statement. The Canadians in this audience will likely have read Charles-Emmanuel's statement. And I quote in part first from President Hodgson, speaking to the state of the international order, and I quote, "That legal order is now under direct assault, both at home and abroad. The list of U.S. initiatives that undermine the international legal order is long. President Hodgson then mentions quite a number of examples that have occurred rapid fire in the news, each one commanding a headline for a day or two at least, until we go on to the next one. Now to this, President Côté responded, and again I quote, "The vision of international relations based on law and justice that has been spearheaded by the SIL since its foundation remains an inspiration and shared aspiration for the CCIL. It has also governed the long-standing friendship and strategic and economic partnerships between Canada and the United States, all of which have been premised on respect for international law and resort to peaceful means of dispute settlement when required." And I guess a number of those mechanisms are already in motion. We will see how it all starts out. Now, to begin this important conversation, I first invite President Hodgson to elaborate on the content of her statement and comment on why she felt compelled to issue it. And then President Côté will follow, and the subsequent questions, each president will get an appropriate lead, except for the last one, when I'm just going to throw it open. President Hodgson?
Sure. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Charles Emmanuel, for being here also for this conversation. And thank you all. I know it's the Friday morning that a lot of people are heading out, so thank you for being here to have this important conversation. And in terms of the statement, I have to give credit to our executive council, our executive committee, our executive director. It was really a community project, and I think that's reflective of the fact that as a community, ASOL, I think, February 13th, we weren't even a month into the administration, and we're probably all a little bit at first stunned by the series of proclamations that were coming out of the White House. It is unprecedented. I mean, so I think we were all a little bit at first stunned, and then started to talk with each other and to think about what the fact that we really needed to say something, in essence. The list is obviously there. Some of these still persist. Some of them seem to have gone a little bit by the wayside. Obviously, in terms of the relationship with Canada, that's still something to be determined, in the sense of, we've had the tariffs go, the whiplash on the tariffs over the past couple of weeks. And we've seen a strong response from Canada, which probably at this point was more still in shock also. I think at that time, we thought, well, and obviously our membership was also clamoring to sort of have statements. There were comments internally before this went out that called for what shall I say, much stronger language on some of these sort of occurrences that were happening. But obviously we also wanted to be moderated, because we wanted to be heard, not only within our own audience, not just the echo chamber, but to have the comments not be shrill and taken just as another, sort of viewed as partisan, and we are nonpartisan, and we didn't want to be seen as doing that. What we wanted to say is, listen, we were founded by a Secretary of State of the United States. The idea that this is what was coming out of the U.S. government, was just shocking. And so we wanted to stay true to the goals, the principles, the foundations of what led Mr. Root and others to found this organization. And it was a commitment to the international rule of law. It was a commitment, as the United States understood it, and to having a system, international rules-based system where you deal with your neighbor in an appropriate other foreigners in an appropriate manner, and that is consistent with the rule of law. Understanding that, yes, every country has self-interest. That's not unusual. That's probably their responsibility. But that to not lose sight of and to have others understand, there is a system and a way to do these things if you want to. Setting aside as a policy matter whether you should be, but there is a way to do this, and this was not the way to be to be behaving as the leader of the free world, so to speak, or at least that's the label that we've had for a long time, and certainly as a leader, a believer in justice and the rule of law, and so. We don't know that we necessarily thought it would reach any real air, get the air, so to speak, of anyone in the administration and have a positive impact in that sense. But what we hope is that others would see that we were maintaining our commitment to the international rule of law and to respecting our neighbors, to respecting human beings, really, whatever their capacity, refugees, migrants, and respecting our commitments to do things the correct way. So we thought it was important to really let it be known, I guess, that we maintained our commitment. We believe in the international rule of law, and and I think also important, one of the discussions we've had here internally at this meeting is the impact that all of this is having on younger people, who've gone through the pandemic and then now are sort of dealing with this chaos in a way. And so to also let our younger members know that we are committed. I think a lot of, we may not act the same way, and we're not on social media every day condemning things, and that's not our way and it's not our role. But to let them know that we are committed to an international system based on the rule of law.
Okay. Cheryl?
Yeah. Our reaction to the statement was first to find it extremely reassuring. I thought, and I'm not the only one at the CCIL, our members, our board members, we thought it was a splendid statement made at a very important time, quite early, in fact. And it recalled the raison d'être, or the reason for international law societies to exist. And our raison d'être is probably even more crucial in times of challenge to the rule of international law. So first of all, we thought it was a splendid statement, and I can tell you that other international law societies across the world, it circulated across the world, and I've received many calls from our European friends, notably, that it was read and spread, and quickly the members, and again, the president's statement that I issued is also collective work. Even though under our rules, the president will take a position in order not to engage the society itself, because we have a diversity of views, but I can tell you that the views were very converging towards that statement, and the idea was basically to simply support your initiative. I consulted extensively with past presidents of the CCIL, board members, non-members, and there was a strong sentiment that it was important to express our support. and that probably for two reasons. In addition to the substance of your statement that was extremely convincing and that you presented again, and the reason to defend the rule of international law are manifold, and you mentioned them, but more specifically for the CCIL, I guess there were two reasons. Additionally, first of all, we as an organization have, since our inception, insisted on the importance of international scientific cooperation. We have had many cooperation initiatives with other international law society, and especially with the American Society of International Law. And I know that my past president sitting next to me was one of the important person in developing this, and we've continued this. We've had trilateral projects, conference, publications in the 90s. We had the Four Societies Initiative in the 2010s, and these initiatives help also involving younger scholars, to which you were referring, in this spirit of collaboration and friendly collaboration with our colleagues. I also thought, and it was an immediate reflex in the situation, that despite the turmoil of the interstate speech and actions perhaps, but mostly speech at the beginning, despite all this, on our level of scholars, we need to keep the channel of communication open. And that is a strong belief that I had, that we are part of the solution in restoring respect for the international rule of law, and starting by maintaining our channels of communication. In fact, this very event is a manifestation of that, and I thank you for that, because I think we have an important role to play here. And I should add another additional reason, and that's the fact that we have a very long-standing relation, the CCIL and the American Society. And I should perhaps not say what I'm going to say, because this might fuel the idea that we should be even closer in our let's say cooperation. But Canada gained independence in a very incremental way, and in the 20s and culminating in the early 30s, we gained full independence from the United Kingdom. So there were no international law society in Canada before that. But in the 1930s, we began to discuss the creation, to gather the community of the emerging community of Canadian international lawyer in the government, but also in universities. And the first reflex was to turn to the American Society of International Law, actually. And there were discussions that we might become a committee of the American Society of International Law. And that's authentic. We even secured a grant from the American Society for helping us in creating a Canadian Society of International Law. Eventually, that collapsed in the chaos of World War II, and we finally created our own International Law Association branch, and later Canadian Council in International Law, without being a committee of the American Society. But just to say that our connection goes back a long way, I would say, from the inception of the idea of having a Canadian Society of International Law. So for all these reasons, for us it was obvious that we wanted to say that we support and we want to continue our very rich and profound cooperation with you, I would say more than ever, probably.
Well, we won't tell anybody outside this room about
let's keep that among ourselves.
any part.
Okay. My second question doesn't have the elaborate preface that preceded the first one, and I think it's largely been answered, but just very briefly, both of you having staked your ground, what can each society possibly do to address the challenge to the international legal order, apart from reaffirming your allegiance to it and an exchange of scholarship and so forth. Just very short answers because I've got some granular questions to follow and I want to leave some time for that. But President Côté, the first statement goes to you.
I think one of the important role that we have in Mérida, you just mentioned it, and I do completely agree with you, the importance of speaking to younger generation that have been through the pandemic, through this complex situation, and not talking about climate change that we seem not to talk about a lot these days, but that's still looming. And so I think we have to preserve as societies the heritage of this very rich discipline that is international law, as an idea, as a key for world peace and security, for development. And I think it's a common heritage of all that we share all, and that as international law societies, we do have a specific responsibility, especially when the rule of international law is seemingly challenged, to be there, to remind that it still matters, that it will continue, even though it's challenged right now in the very current political situation, but to have a sort of more long-term perspective on everything that happens. I think that's a role we can have. We can provide historical perspective. There are things that we witness now that have happened before, and international law has survived. And I think we can bring that knowledge to the public debate. Maybe we can influence government actors. I don't know. We hope we can. At least we like to think that we can. And again, this idea of keeping channels of communication between societies of international law is part of. We seem to not talk anymore about transnationalism now. We're back to interstate. Everything is interstate, and like 10 years ago, everything was transnational. And we are part of the transnational discussion. The International Law Society, our very collaboration is part of that. And I think, again, we're also maintaining these channels of communication in these times of more complex interstate relations.
I totally agree. And first of all, let me say that we also appreciate the support of pretty much immediately coming out and supporting our statement, because I think one of the things that we've talked about in this meeting in particular is the importance of solidarity. We're all sort of used to, whether on an individual basis or an organizational basis, sort of doing our own thing, just continuing on, because we never had to think about doing it differently, really. We do collaborations, and that's periodic, they're specific. And it is a moment where I think we need to be together and support each other. The importance of education. You mentioned that, I mentioned that. But also just the personal relationships. I know that what I'm hearing, or what I've heard over the last couple of days, is how important people have felt that they've been able to just talk to each other. I think it's we're all a little bit concerned about what we're saying on our phones, because apparently, if you travel, your phone can be looked at, right? And so we've all my sense is we've all sort of self-censored a little bit, which of course is unfortunate, because that's part of the fear that's created, and that gives effect to what's going on. So it was important for people, I think, on a personal level to have this community to speak to each other. And to because that's the first part of being able to actually take action, is the ability to talk to each other and to feel that you're in a safe space to discuss how do we advance our objectives of protecting the international rule of law and the international legal order. You have to be in communication, and so one of the things that's been important is being here and being able to do that. Now we have to follow through on that, of course, and there is a lot of work to be done. the world is going to go on regardless of what the United States is doing, right? I personally think that the big loser ultimately in all of this is going to be the United States, and that's unfortunate, and that's something that we who are Americans have to think about and figure out how we do that, how we protect that. But more importantly, we shouldn't be stepping aside, whether in disgust or shame. I think both emotions are probably there. We need to continue to, on our level, engage with our fellow societies, with our colleagues, because I think the average American still believes in these principles, and certainly we who are involved in the international community do believe in these principles. And I think we have to just continue to speak to each other and to educate and to relate. It's not just educating the youth, but relating this to people who may not understand some of the details that we understand about it, and relating it in a respectful way, to find common ground. I mean, there are people who have legitimate grievances about, what's happened to them economically as a result of globalization. And some of those voices haven't necessarily really been heard in this country. And I think we want to be respectful of that while explaining that, this is probably not the answer to that. Or even if you think it's the answer, the way it's being done is counterproductive, really.
Thank you. Next question is a little more granular. And the headlines kind of outline some of those issues. Among them are the tariff war, which seems to be morphing on a weekly, if not a daily basis. U.S. territorial aspirations, not just for the 51st state, how they'd handle 10 provinces and territories in that context is another question that hopefully we never even get close to that. But anyway, Greenland, Panama Canal, departures from existing treaty commitments, the USMCA, or as we like to call it, in the Great White North, CUSMA, and U.S. alignment in the General Assembly, among other places, with strange bedfellows like Russia and not China of late, but a few others. And I invite each of our presidents to pick whatever issue they're comfortable with to comment on in that regard. But as a small preface to that, I would like to go to give you a quotation from my teacher, former president of this society, writing at the time I was still in high school. And it was an obituary for Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter, and he published this article in the AJIL way back when. We're going back 50 years. And he said this: the failure of the UN Charter's normative system is tantamount to the inability of any rule in itself to have much control over the behavior of states. National self-interest, particularly the national self-interest of the superpowers, has usually won out over treaty obligations. But then he adds, this is the interesting part, living by power alone is nerve-wracking and costly business. To do it, much must be surrendered by the citizen. Individual freedom, something that's being talked about now. A large part of his national budget, tax dollars, and the chance to live in that comparative tranquility which comes of being liked by others and liking oneself. There are increasingly signs that the citizen will not indefinitely pay the price demanded by the conventional national interest. Now, at that point in time, Tom was writing in the latter stages the height, but also close to the closing of the Vietnam War, and growing American societal discomfort with America's commitment to that conflict and which way it was going. And my question is, are we perhaps in another, it's a different, but another such analogous time? President Hodgson, you again have the floor.
Sure, and I'm going to start by making reference to the first time I went to Vietnam, which was 20 years ago, because you bring up Vietnam, and what I'm trying to say with all of this is that the overarching thing is you do have to look at the long game and think that way. And I was a little bit nervous. It was 1990. That was 2004, I guess. Yeah, and I was a little bit nervous about what their attitudes would be. Wonderful people, sold me everything they could, and I bought it. And all was going swimmingly. And the night that I was returning, I was picked up by a driver, and I have to say this was while I worked for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and I had a friend who had been in that office who was there working on the discussions really funded by U.S. businesses on normalizing the economic relationship. And so driver picked me up. He said, "Oh, I hope you don't mind. I have my son. He speaks better English." Not a problem. He was a kid, probably like 9 years old. And so very chatty kid. And so at one point he says, "Do you know why everybody hates America?" And I thought, here it is. I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're going to kill them. Ha, ha, ha." And I thought, okay. Now, if you think back, 2004, we had another war going at that time, which did not make the United States popular. And a lot of, unfortunately, some of the actions of the U.S. government during that time were not that great. Well, but, that's an understatement. And I can only think, look where we are with Vietnam today, and I can only think it's 20 years past the Iraq War, in essence, that, I think there was a lot of U.S. conduct that people were not proud of at that time, and still we're not proud of. So I want to look at it as sort of a long-term thing, and we have to just focus, excuse me, on the fact that I really do believe, this too shall pass. And one of the reasons I believe this too shall pass, which is something my mother used to say, is that you talk about how much, when Professor Frank was writing this, how much will Americans tolerate? And I do believe in the sort of innate goodness, fairness, kindness of the American people. And I do believe there's also a little bit of, okay, we can tolerate a lot of, just chat, talk. And that's, when you speak to people today and they're like, well, I thought he was just, talking the way he talks, and didn't think that some of the actions that have now followed would actually happen. Of course, they weren't thinking about who's behind him and what those people's goals were. But I do believe in that, and I do believe we're already seeing pushback. You have Republican congressmen afraid to go to their town halls because people, and it's not just Democrats showing up to crash those town halls. They are generally people who have relationships with Canada, who live on the border with Canada, and who this is not what they think it should be. This is not what they signed up for. None of this. They did sign up for perhaps tariffs, and that's a discussion I mentioned before, that there are people in this country who have been left behind to a certain extent by what I think is the consensus that all of these trade agreements are really for the benefit of all, and there's been a poor communication message, perhaps, the fact that there are benefits, but fundamentally we're also at a point where, it's my personal view that those manufacturing jobs are not going to come back, and that's what those people have been led to believe, that these actions will somehow lead to that. And I think as they begin to see that they've been sold something that is not possible, then yes, we will see the sort of beginnings of a backlash and a demand for change. And I think what we can do to support people who were trying to understand better is educate on tariffs and the fact that we are really an interconnected system, not only in terms of our border and the border to the south of the United States, but also just the economy that we have worldwide. Our economy is dependent on having these interactions with our trading partners. And 100% tariff or 140% tariff is not going to do it. And it's going to affect maybe, I can't discount the possibility that there maybe is a sector of the economy that might benefit from that. But the overall is that there are others suffering on the other end. And there's been a lot of discussion recently about small businesses in the United States who are dependent on those economic relationships and who can't afford to pay because this is the thing, it's not really a tax on China or Canada, it's a tax on you. And maybe some of that tax balances out somehow, some way, but at 100 and whatever percent, at 30%, at 40%, the small businessman who lives in your community is not benefiting from that, is suffering, really. And I think our job, we do, maybe sometimes we don't think about simpler things like trade and trade policy and explaining that to people because we are more concerned about the international rule of law, and that's sort of up here. But I think one of the things that we need to do, and we do have the experts in our societies who can explain this, is to really kind of focus on how do we reach people who need to understand all of this. And we do, I believe we can explain and we can offer nonpartisan advice on, here's how you understand these issues. And it's important not only from the economic perspective, but again, from the personal relationship perspective. I'm hearing that there are Americans who are nervous about going abroad, and maybe that's a goal of, frankly, another goal of the administration. They think everybody should stay here. But that's not going to happen. So you have Americans who are abroad who are also being negatively impacted by this. And so I think our work is to, whether it be at the international rule of law, sort of more academic level, if I can put it that way, but also at a more sort of personal level for the quote-unquote average American, to explain sort of what is happening and to help them sort of comprehend sort of their role in, quite frankly, not ensuring a disaster or ensuring that we don't have a disaster.
Well, yeah, thank you. Concerning Americans going abroad, I should say that you are most welcome to come to Canada, and specifically to the CCIL conference in November to continue and be exposed to these ideas. And I really hope that we will continue this discussion in Ottawa. I like the idea that you mentioned that the American people feel it's not what they signed for. I will use that to tell you that I think Canadians feel that they didn't sign for that when they signed trade agreements with the United States. When we signed these agreements, we felt that the United States would respect its word, and would apply the trade disciplines that are there, with respect its commitments of tariff, its tariff commitments, etc. So on that specific point, in Canada, I cannot stress enough how shocked people are about it. It's a very big shock that we feel we cannot trust the treaty commitments, whatever the economic reason is. But there are ways to change your mind in a lawful fashion. And what it come as a shock and a surprise is that. And when we look at it more carefully, we look that there is actually a selective departure from treaty commitments. Not all treaty commitments, actually. It's mostly what we witness is a collapse of the legalization of trade relations between our two countries, specifically in the field of trade, because even in international economic relations more broadly, we still have investment state disputes that are going on, and nobody said, well, there are no treaties, we don't follow the treaties on which are based those. So it's a very specific problem at the moment, is the collapse of that legalization of trade relations. And with that is entailed a series of problems. First of all the countermeasures that now Canada and other countries have applied are basically applied outside the framework where we're supposed to impose countermeasures. We're supposed to file a complaint, wait for a report, see if the losing party has implemented the report. If not, we can impose. And that is all gone. We just are ourselves applying countermeasure to respond to the political urgency to act, and that comes as a shock for lawyers as well, because we're navigating in a sea that seems to be no more chartered by international law in the specific field of international trade. I would say. So with the breach of treaties came a breach of trust, I think, and I know that we are talking and there are people in the room that will be having the important task of dealing concretely with that. But how can we negotiate a deal when the deal that we currently have is not even respected? So beyond the breach of treaty, there's a breach of trust, and hopefully our societies can be part of a solution in creating conditions that are favorable to a restoration of respect for a culture and a climate of respect of treaties. And even the way the breach of treaties is, I would say, staged is kind of shocking, using social network to basically say we'll do whatever we want and not even respect our treaties. That comes as a shock for our two countries, the relations of which were based since its inception on international treaties in every field possible of cooperation, be it use or co-management of water resources, to borders, to trade, to transportation, to anything. And this staging of the breach of trade treaty is something that is also quite surprising. In Canada, we say Canada-United States relations will never be the same. That's the mood right now. Let's say that trust will need to be restored, I think, for thinking that treaty commitments can be made and will be respected. And that's going to be difficult, I think. Difficult to restore that trust. And again, I think it's really specifically in the trade world that we have this breach of treaty. We should not oversimplify. I think the most majority of our treaty relationships are unaltered by the current situation. But in the trade field, there's something special. And I think that Canada took from the rule of international perspective, the only sound way, that is to challenge every measure that can be challenged before the WTO, before panels of the USMCA, of the CUSMA in Canadian parlance. And I think even though these processes are maybe not as how to say in good shape than they used to be. Still, I think that is something that is a basis for building a new trust relationship, is that we will not just let that go without reacting in using all legal remedies that are at our disposal.
Yeah, I can't really say much to that. It's, yeah.
It is what it is.
It is a breach of trust, and it takes time to rebuild that.
I've got two questions left and less than 10 minutes on the clock, but we started a little bit late. My fourth question is a little more nuanced and perhaps a little more granular still. Both Canada and the U.S. are single nation states in the eyes of international law, but at the same time, we're both sprawling federal states. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fair to say that in our respective countries, there's divergent economic and other interests in different parts of each of our countries. And that became apparent in various Canadian delegations to Washington, not simply the federal government, which is well represented in this room, but also provincial premiers, notably the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, who initially quite liked the new President of the United States until the oil tariffs hit, and the Premier of Ontario, who is much more kind of bullish in terms of how he thought Canada should respond to all of this, and that from his point of view as a provincial premier, he was going to, we're going to hit him back with everything we've got. And on the American side, a little different, not at this level. You don't have parades of U.S. governors coming to Washington, and Melida pointed out to me yesterday that maybe there was not much point in that. However, governors of various U.S. states, Michigan, Wisconsin, latterly California, which is a big kahuna, almost the same population as Canada. Governor Newsom said, the state of California is going to chart a different course. I mean, there's a lot of winemakers there who are really upset, not to mention distillers of Kentucky bourbon, and given that we in Canada, and I like both of those libations, and they're not available on our shelves right now. But I just, very succinctly, I just invite each of your comments on, the federalism overlay to this, and how it plays, if at all, in the situation we're currently in. And just very brief responses, because I want a little bit of time for the last question.
Sure.
Yep. Okay, go. Yeah. A lot of things to say on the federalism angle of that, and I will not mention the fact that the mathematics changes because you have 50 plus 10, and not 51 if you look at federalism. But I will not go into that.
Don't tell them that.
I think both internally and externally, subnational units may play a role in the current context. Externally, Canadian provinces, including my own province of Quebec, already has several ties with U.S. states and signed agreements on important issues such as climate change with California. And that's an example that when the political dialogue is complex at the federal level between the two states, at the subnational state, there are ways to further some policy objectives, including on climate change. And I think what we witness is, and we will witness that, and I know that there are some trade agreements that are signed by U.S. States with the UK, for instance. There's a rising salience of these type of instruments, which would be labeled probably adequately as non-binding international agreements, which is actually a topic that has been picked up by the International Law Commission right now, but the excluded subnational unit for some reason, because it's complicated, but still, I think that is something that might be rising as a trend. And internally, internally, I think within our own system of foreign relations law, provinces or U.S. state do play a role somewhere within the process of either implementing treaties or ratification of treaties through the Congress via, for instance, the Senate or etc. So in terms of lawfully withdrawing from international agreements, for instance, there might be a room for influence for subnational units, and that's another role that could be played by subnational entities in the current context, like in protecting the rule of international law.
I definitely think that, you know, I remember when I was at USTR and we were negotiating, I think it was the CAFTA agreement, and there's the government procurement part, which of course for the U.S. there's always an overlay of Buy American provisions, which are laws which were never changed in this country. So you had to work consistent with that. And all of a sudden, this was a movement by an organization that I will not mention, but we started getting calls from various governors' offices that they were not, like, well, you know, they're not going to agree to have their procurement open. You know, to be dealt with at the federal level through these agreements, and a lot of them pulled out their commitments. That, you know, it was just sort of, now there was a lot of really blatant disinformation about what the agreements did and what was allowed. But part of that also, we were starting to see that some of the states were doing things on their own. So they wanted to negotiate it themselves. So I do think that that's something that, whether we call it international law or not, it is a transnational relationship, and it's at the sub-level, but nonetheless, I think we may see more of that. I agree.
Thank you. Last question, and I'm going to ask for the audience's indulgence. We'll go a little bit over time, but not much into your coffee break. And I think this last question in some ways is the most critical one of the lot. And that goes to, our longstanding principles of the international legal order advanced by our respective societies, and you've heard about that up front, are essentially up for reinterpretation, dilution, abandonment, or what have you, or should they be assiduously defended as we've originally understood them to be? Now, I'm reverting to Tom Frank's scholarship again because I really like the way he writes, but it's also very prescient as to what he said, this time 20 years after my first quote in his book, The Power of Legitimacy Among Nations, which he published in 1990. And he says, no rule may be better than a bad rule, or one which has outlived its utility. Now, is that where we are now? Melida?
No rule is better than a bad rule, or I don't know that we're there yet. I don't think it's all totally gone, because I think we also have to focus. Yes, there's some action behind a lot of these, particularly in the trade arena, and yes, that it feels very bad because the actions are being taken outside of the rules. But you're also responding by working with the rules, and that's, you know, that's a good thing. So the question will be in a year or two, and that's a long time to wait, but whether or not the rules are really functioning, right? And so I wouldn't say that it's not a bad rule. The problem is you have human beings who can sometimes be bad, and I wouldn't discard the rule because we have bad actors or actors who aren't willing to live by the rules. I think the rules can survive if others try to reinforce it and to act as much consistently as possible with those rules. So I wouldn't give up on the rule yet. I don't think we're there.
I could not agree more. I mean, if there's a rule that we cannot give up on is the rule of pacta sunt servanda, that treaties must be observed. And even though there's, like I said, and you referred to in the trade field right now, quite a big challenge to that. Let's see in 2 years where we'll be. But I think that rule should certainly not be left, and as it's the most basic rule for the whole building of international law. So every action that will reinforce the obligatory force of treaty must be taken, including, like I said, these remedies that are sought by Canada, for instance, before the trade forums that are available to it, in a spirit of believing still in the rule that treaties must be observed. In line with treaty, one rule that is, and it'll be, if you allow me for just take a minute to bring the discussion beyond Canada and the United States and towards the situation in Ukraine, for instance. We're talking right now, and I was watching TV while I was here, and there are a lot of talks about the U.S. trying to solve the war in Ukraine and having a treaty signed, and I cannot help but being saddened by the fact that the mere idea that a treaty would be signed to end an unlawful war is just unlawful itself. A treaty signed under the threat or the actual use of force is against international law by itself. It should not even be, there should not even be a negotiation of anything. And that, I thought, was an important rule of the international legal order inherited from the reconstruction of international after World War II. And that, I think, should be saved, but I'm skeptical if that rule will survive the practice of states right now, because it seems not to be part at all of the equation, that there should not even be any discussion. Peace treaties, as we knew them before, are unlawful. And we should not even think of accepting that. And I'm a little bit worried about the survival of that rule in the current world. But that would be my point of worry.
Okay. Thank you both for your very instructive responses to my questions, and hopefully you've appreciated the dialogue. There's no time left for questions, unfortunately, and I don't want to leave my teacher Tom Frank in a bad place, because he also said, and this was a quote at the beginning of this Society's movie that was again shown at this meeting, and his quote's right up there at the beginning: "Stand tall for the rule of law." And the comment I quoted, and I chose it particularly for the kind of the situation we're in, where the international legal order is under stress. But he also went on to say that, you know, like out of the ashes of an old rule come great new ones. And I guess the one example that kind of hits home to me is the law of genocide coming out of World War II. And the international community does, I mean, we've got an organic system of law here that moves along. But that said, there's some grounding principles we want to hang on to. And I can't agree more with Pacta Sunt Servanda, and you know, they've been good companions, good meeting grounds for our two nations and around the world, the global legal order. So thank you all very much for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent.